A full night can still leave yesterday's learning unusually rigid. The deeper question is whether repeated interruption reduce the opportunity to update memory, rather than merely whether sleep stored it. That difference matters because someone may remember the broad outline yet struggle to integrate corrections, context, or emotional nuance. A broad label can describe the experience while hiding several distinct processes that would require different kinds of evidence. The tempting story is that memory is a single file that sleep either saves or fails to save. A more careful interpretation is that storage and later updating are different conceptual operations, and each layer can change without the others moving in parallel. This episode, therefore, treats the topic as an evaluation problem rather than a promise. We will separate what is observed, what is inferred, and what would still need direct measurement. Now, the consequence is practical. When several processes are compressed into one explanation, a person may change the wrong variable and misread the result as confirmation. By the resolution, the goal is a narrower answer. Which part of the model is useful? Which part remains hypothetical? And which conclusion the available context cannot justify? The observable problem begins here. Someone may remember the broad outline yet struggle to integrate corrections, context, or emotional nuance. That observation deserves attention, but it does not identify a biological cause by itself. Several neighboring influences can create a similar pattern. In this topic, relevant alternatives include fatigue, attention, mood, breathing disturbance, and total sleep opportunity can resemble a memory-specific problem. So interpretation must begin before mechanism language becomes specific. Separate the outward experience from the proposed pathway. The experience can be genuine even when the biological explanation attached to it remains uncertain or incomplete. For timing, compare one disturbed night and its immediate next day consequences with a recurring pattern in which disruption, recovery, and individual resilience interact. Transient transition effects and sustained patterns answer different questions and should be interpreted separately. Individual variation is not a footnote. Sleep timing, arousal pattern, prior learning, stress, substances, and underlying sleep conditions may alter the experience. Follow the evidence boundary rather than treating one person's response as a general template. The stakes extend beyond scientific accuracy. Overconfident explanations can turn a useful observation into a rigid protocol, an unnecessary fear, or a medical claim that supplied evidence did not establish. Start with consolidation, meaning the stabilization of a newly formed memory representation. This term identifies one layer of the problem, but it should not be expanded beyond what is actually measured or conceptually defined. Next is reconsolidation, meaning the revision of a memory after it is reactivated. It overlaps with the first concept, yet it represents a different level of explanation and may require different evidence. The relationship between these ideas is conditional rather than automatic. They may move together under some circumstances, separate under others, or appear linked because a third factor influences both. A useful systems view begins with a repeating sleep architecture with changing internal conditions across the night. The important feature is coordination across stages, not the presence of one isolated component. The conceptual input is a recently learned memory that may be reactivated during later processing. That input does not determine the outcome alone. Timing, prior state, competing demands, and recovery conditions can redirect what follows. The intermediate step is a temporary window in which old and new information could be integrated. This is where many popular explanations become too confident, because an invisible transition is described as though it had been directly observed. The proposed output is a memory that is not only retained but remains flexible when circumstances change. Even here, subjective experience, task performance, structural measurement, and clinical outcome remain separate endpoints. The main boundary is that the model explains a possible relationship, not a diagnosis. Without verified claims, it cannot specify effect size, prevalence, treatment value, or a guaranteed direction of change. Mechanistically, the first step is a change in conditions around the system. That change may alter which pathways are available, but it does not prove that a particular pathway dominated. The second step is allocation. Limited resources, timing opportunities, or network routes may be redistributed. The word may matters because the redistribution has not been measured in this job. A third step concerns coordination. Several local processes could remain functional while their timing or interaction becomes less efficient, producing an uneven result rather than a total failure. Here is the mechanistic question: where does the bottleneck appear? It may sit at entry, transfer, integration, recovery, or measurement, and each location predicts a different pattern. Feedback complicates the story. The initial experience can change behavior, expectation, stress, and later exposure, creating a loop that looks biological even when several layers are interacting. Compensation can also preserve outward performance. A system may recruit alternate routes or greater effort, masking strain until demand increases or the supporting condition changes. Conceptual thresholds should be handled carefully. A small disruption may be absorbed, while repeated or combined disruptions could exceed available flexibility. Yet this job cannot assign a precise threshold. Instability often appears as variability rather than constant impairment. Good periods and difficult periods can coexist, which makes single observations especially vulnerable to overinterpretation. Context changes the meaning of the same experience. A demanding task, unfamiliar environment, poor sleep, illness, or expectation can expose a limitation that remains invisible under easier conditions. Observation and inference must stay separate. We can observe performance, timing, or subjective experience. The hidden cellular explanation remains a hypothesis unless an appropriate measure directly supports it. The nearest cause may differ from the final consequence. A local change may alter effort without changing accuracy, or affect short-term performance without implying long-term decline. Acute response and adaptation also differ. The body and behavior may settle into a new routine, but adaptation does not automatically mean improvement, safety, or biological optimization. Measurement creates another boundary. Indirect markers, self-reports, laboratory tasks, and real-world function can disagree because they sample different aspects of the same broad topic. Separate the mechanism from the outcome. The causal gap is therefore central. A plausible sequence can organize questions, but plausibility alone cannot establish that the sequence occurs, dominates, or produces a clinically meaningful result. The full conceptual chain is conditions, transition, coordination, compensation, and observed outcome. The chain reveals where evidence would be needed before stronger language becomes justified. A serious counterpoint is that a difficult morning does not isolate reconsolidation, because ordinary sleepiness can reduce performance before memory flexibility is tested. This prevents the thesis from becoming an explanation for many unrelated difficult experiences. A rational exception also exists. A memory that was strongly learned beforehand may remain accessible even when later updating feels less efficient. A broad mechanism can be relevant without controlling the full range of tasks, memories, symptoms, or individual responses. An alternative explanation is equally important. The apparent rigidity may arise from impaired attention during retrieval rather than from altered overnight memory processing. Competing explanations should be compared, not mentioned only after the preferred story has already been accepted. The first limitation is measurement. Without a direct and appropriate measure, the proposed internal process may be inferred from an outcome that several other processes can produce. The second limitation is transfer. A finding under one condition, population, task, or time frame may not apply to daily life or to a person with different constraints. A bounded validating case would look like this. The hypothesis is most useful when the same person can retain familiar material, yet has difficulty incorporating changed rules or revised context. Even then, the case supports the usefulness of the framework, not a broad clinical conclusion. These boundaries do not make the topic meaningless. They make the resolution more precise by showing which question can be answered conceptually and which question remains evidence-dependent. The opening question can now be answered in layers. First, fragmented sleep may matter less as a simple loss of storage and more as a possible loss of uninterrupted updating opportunity. This is a narrower claim than saying the mechanism has been clinically proven. What matters clinically is the interpretation should track the type of outcome being discussed. Subjective improvement, task performance, biomarker change, and long-term health are different claims. Second, the model predicts variability rather than uniform response. Different starting states and competing influences can produce opposite experiences without either person proving a general rule. Third, timing changes interpretation. A transition effect can be real yet temporary, while a stable later pattern can reflect adaptation, compensation, or a different set of constraints. The framework changes the next question from "did this work" to "which layer changed." That shift reduces confirmation bias and makes future evidence easier to evaluate. What does not follow is equally important. A plausible mechanism does not establish an effective intervention, a safe protocol, a prevented disease, or a durable improvement. Uncertainty should remain visible rather than hidden behind technical vocabulary. Precise biological terms can sound authoritative even when the actual evidence boundary is broad. A practical decision rule is to match claim strength to measurement strength. The farther the claim moves from what was directly observed, the more qualified the language should become. So the central promise resolves this way. Use the mechanism to organize questions, not to manufacture certainty. The model is most valuable when it exposes missing links. For application, begin here. Compare nights with stable routines against nights with repeated awakenings while observing flexibility, not merely recall. Change one interpretable variable at a time when the action is low risk and already appropriate for your situation. Next, separate subjective experience from performance. A personal note about energy or clarity can be useful, but it should not be renamed as a biomarker or clinical outcome. Observe patterns across contexts rather than searching for one dramatic day. Compare demand, timing, sleep, stress, and routine, so the same outcome is not assigned to one favored cause. When comparing conditions, keep the question narrow. Ask whether a specific experience changed under a specific context, not whether the entire biological system became optimized. Track uncertainty as carefully as the observation. Record competing explanations, relevant context, and what was not measured before drawing a conclusion. Measure what is actually supported. The safety boundary is direct. Persistent sleep disruption, breathing symptoms, or major daytime impairment belongs in a qualified clinical conversation rather than a self-designed experiment. Avoid using a conceptual episode to start, stop, or intensify a medical, dietary, or supplement intervention. The strongest takeaway is an evaluation habit. Distinguish observation, mechanism, evidence type, population boundary, and clinical significance before accepting an optimization claim or changing a health routine. Use that framework the next time a confident biological explanation appears. Ask what changed, how it was measured, what else could explain it, and what conclusion remains unsupported. Keep the interpretation bounded, especially when the topic touches symptoms or health decisions. Optimize the protocol, protect your brain, and I'll see you in the next data set.